The invasion of Iraq was an illegal invasion based on false intelligence. Blair's lies were sort of virtuous in a way. The narrative over since October the 7th has been one lie after another, told by the Israelis, of course, but also told by the British politicians on their behalf.
Today, we are honored to welcome Peter Oborne as our guest author. Peter is a well-established, award-winning journalist and writer and the author of a number of books.
I'll tell you a little bit about the origins of this book and who I am. In the first half of my career, I had a fairly conventional existence, quite successful. I became the political columnist for the Sunday Express, which was a rather a distinguished right-wing paper. Then I was hired by Boris Johnson to join him when he was the editor of The Spectator. I became the political correspondent, which is a very important role. And Spectator is the leading, should we say, conservative journals. I then went on to the Daily Mail as political correspondent and as chief political correspondent at the Daily Telegraph, which was then anyway the leading conservative journal in this country. I think I had a wake-up call, and something changed for me very profoundly at the time of the Iraq War. I was very proud to work for the Spectator and for the Telegraph and so on, but I felt that the British conservatism and Britain itself was essentially a decent country which respected institutions, rule of law, parliament, the monarchy. And that's my understanding of conservatism, based really around the teachings of, say, Edmund Burke, the fiery Irish philosopher, writer of the politician of the late 18th century. That's what I was, a Burkean conservative. Along comes the Iraq War, and Britain gets involved in the invasion of Iraq. The invasion of Iraq was an illegal invasion based on false intelligence and caused chaos. And that is the moment when I felt to myself, I felt rather ashamed. Not that I'd supported the Iraq War, but I realized that there were veins of conservatism and something going on, really, which needed to be fought. It was followed by the upsurge in Islamophobia. I decided that I needed to pay attention to foreign affairs in a way I hadn't before. And then I went and reported from Iraq. I reported then later from many conflicts, mainly in the Muslim world. I spent a lot of time in Pakistan during the war on terror and witnessed most appalling things. I was still a conservative, but I was educating myself during this time and witnessing all sorts of things. And part of that education process were frequent visits or regular visits to Israel, Palestine, particularly the West Bank, Gaza sometimes, and the wider Middle East. I covered the Syria war quite a lot, civil war. And so this takes, and at one stage I went and lived for 3 months in Nablus, which is the most wonderful city built by Vespasian, by the Romans in 72 AD, just after Vespasian or Titus had destroyed Jerusalem. And it's still the same city, really, the same street structure, and just the buildings of, at one time they were a Roman temple, then they become a Christian church, and then they've gone through the full journey, then they become a mosque. It's quite fascinating, and the old Roman canal is still there, and it runs underneath the city. And in the evening, when the lights are going dim, you can easily imagine the sort of Roman legions just talking. And I love that place. And when I stay there, and I do recommend it actually. If you're ever in the West Bank, go to Nablus and stay at the Turquoise Hostel, which is it's an Ottoman building in the old city. It was partly destroyed in the Second Intifada by an Israeli attack. But on the top of it, is a rooftop sort of cafe, and I was there in October 2024. I was there sitting on the rooftop cafe, looking at the stars, and actually a few days earlier, the missiles had been going from. You could see them from the. I wasn't there when it happened, but the people could see them. The missiles going over from Tehran towards Tel Aviv, and you could see. I believe you could see them on the way back as well. You know, the counter fire. It was quite a place to be in a way. And I was looking up at the stars, and I suddenly realised that I had to write the book, which I'm now talking about. And I had to, and I realised I was in a unique position to write this particular book because I'd had that deep experience of reporting British politics. And at that time, a conservative government was in power, but actually, I knew how British politics at quite a deep level work. Almost everybody, every British figure in this book, but certainly the politicians and the journalists, I know personally. Some of them I know very well, and I've seen that. I've talked to them about stuff. I understand what their journey is, who they are, for people like David Cameron, for instance, I'd known very well. I was able to interpret how he conducted himself. Similarly with Andrew Mitchell, who was his deputy when he was British Foreign Secretary, and all of this meant that I had a profound insight in how the British political system worked. I understood the conservative part, and furthermore, I had presented a film and written a long pamphlet. I was the only British journalist to have done so 15 years ago for Channel 4. The film was for Channel 4 on the pro-Israel lobby in Britain. And that would have been a remarkable piece of investigation. Nothing like it has been done in Britain before or since. And I realized that actually having done a film like that, it had given me an understanding into the nature of the Israel lobby and how it operates in our country. That was something which was you can't really walk away from it totally, particularly not in the situation which was emerging, or the horror which had emerged on October the 7th and beyond. And that was the second thing. The other thing was that I have spent the last 10 years as as associate editor, but as a reporter stroke columnist for Middle East Eye, which is do read it. It's very important. It's which reports on the Middle East and particularly on Palestine. It's sympathetic to the Palestinian predicament. And thanks to working for Middle East Eye, I had some understanding of how the occupation operates in the West Bank. I'd seen it at first hand. I'd written about it. I'd written about the politics of it. I'd read about the past. And the final thing was that I also wrote two books about political lying. One about at the time when Tony Blair was the British Prime Minister, and I was so horrified by the lies which Blair kept on putting out about Iraq, but many other things as well. And I realized that the book really was identifying a new political epistemology. And I wrote another book then called Assault on Truth, which was prompted by the fact that as I say, I knew Boris Johnson exceptionally well. He'd been my editor. I talked to him at least once a week, possibly several times a week. But when he started to shape up as a future prime minister, you just couldn't get away from the fact that he was a profligate liar. And on a scale which we have, it's almost Trumpian, right? And Blair's lies were sort of virtuous in a way. But he saw by which I mean not that they were virtuous, but he saw them as virtuous. He felt he was gifted a greater truth about how the world worked, progressive politics, and was virtuous, and therefore to lie in the service of his own political career was virtuous. Whereas Johnson's were much more cynical and much more like Trump's, just for the fun of it. Still very important. But the key point I'm trying to get here is that the narrative since October the 7th has been one lie after another. told by the Israelis, of course, but also told by the British politicians on their behalf. You cannot lie in politics unless the press allows you to. That is what enables political lying. If the press, certainly in this country, so it was this brought me on to the complicity of the media. There's been so many lies told about what has been happening. You know, what the casualty rate is one military death to one civilian death, according to Benjamin Netanyahu, iterated in the British media by his supporters. I go through all of these. I go through a lot of these lies and the structure of mendacity, which has been a key part of the Israeli propaganda effort in the book. And so those were the four things. I understood British politics. I knew them. I knew the West Bank in particular, but the Jerusalem, but Israel quite well. Gaza, I'd been there. I understood the structure of lying, and I understood British politics. It enabled me to write a book examining Britain's criminal complicity with the destruction of Gaza. That is, I had this light bulb moment, this sort of eureka moment, looking at the stars in Nablus, and I knew I had to write the book. And the first thing I did, I rang up that evening, immediately, Jamie Viner, who is a student, a protege of aflame in Oxford University, the greatest living expert, really, of contemporary Israel, one of the new historians who reinterpreted the history of Israel when the 30-year rule was opened up, what happened in 1948. And I said to him a few years earlier, I said, could you recommend me a researcher to write? And he said, yes. Who's your best researcher? He said, Jamie Viner. And I rang up Jamie. This was 3 years ago. I said, Jamie, I gave him some research, and he came back. He was so good that what he had done was so brilliant. He had a much deeper knowledge and understanding of these matters than I did. I had to tell him he couldn't be my researcher because it would be embarrassing for me to pass off his work as mine. But I rang him up and said, would you like to co-write the book? And he said, no, actually, I after thought about it for a bit, but he said no. But I will publish it. He works for a publisher. It's a little New York radical publisher called All Books, based in the East Side. Not that I know New York. And I said, well, you can publish it so long as you are the editor of the book, because I'm lazy. I just wanted to have the best possible person to guide me through it. And I should say that this book is a collaboration. It can't be regarded as my own work. I was drawing, I mean, some of it obviously is, and I did give it the narrative, but it relied on the extraordinary knowledge of Jamie, it's been a collaboration with him, even though Middle East Eye. We have an extraordinary person, our Jerusalem bureau chief, Lubna Masawa, and she and I used to go out there and do reporting with her. And she understands everything. She speaks Hebrew, she speaks English, she speaks Arabic. She's Israeli Palestinian, and I work. And this taught me so much, and so many of my other colleagues. And then I drew, although the mainstream media, as I say in the book, has failed in Britain, as it has many other places, the alternative media has been quite extraordinarily good. Declassified the website when it comes to the military role of Britain. Then I've drawn on the amazing work done by Haaretz, which is an Israeli paper, 972 magazine, which is again Israeli. And actually, some of the mainstream Israeli papers do some very much better work, whereas the mainstream British papers really wouldn't touch the key themes which have defined and explained the Israeli atrocities. The Dahia doctrine, for instance, basically never got mentioned, which is the doctrine exposed by the doctrine set out when Israel went into South Lebanon in the noughties. The doctrine became, we got to send a message. We can destroy whatever civilian infrastructure we like, but just to send a message that you don't mess with us. And that Dahia doctrine was how that then became part of the central thrust of what happening in Gaza, and explains the utter devastation and the mindless slaughter of civilians, because it didn't matter. Hannibal Directive, what happened on October the 7th itself, when Israel slaughtered quite a lot of its own people to stop them being taken hostage. And those points are much better explained in the Israeli press, oddly enough, than most of the British press. But there has been some fantastic electronic intifada. I drew on some of their work. I drew on my own Middle East Eye, which I wrote for. And so I pillaged, quite shamelessly, the work done by, and with attribution, of course, always, the work done by others. Al Jazeera has done a great work throughout this business. Of course, been banned by Israel, and I also hired very, very good researchers. It's a very complex subject. You can't. I say complex subjects. The actual story is simple of an illegal occupation in an apartheid state, but just getting the facts and this, making sure you're utterly fair, give the right of, allow people you're criticizing to be able to, where appropriate, to be able to put their own point of view. All of that, you've got, attention to detail has to be very, very thorough. There are more than 1,000 footnotes in this book. Or endnotes is the right expression, isn't it, these days? And everything is set out and explained. And I'm coming up to the end of my half an hour, but the thesis of the book, I tell it as a narrative, pretty well. Although I start with the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, a verdict that provisional orders should be issued to Israel to avert a potential genocide in Gaza. I start at that critical moment in January 2024, and because that sets out here you have South Africa as really the beacon of the global South, intervening on behalf of universal human values. And the rule of law, and then I take it back to October the 7th, the catastrophic decision by Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, to give unequivocal, I think was his word, support for the Israeli military operation, a green light, in other words, to do what they want. Then the failure of Sir Keir Starmer, a famous human rights lawyer, to challenge that analysis, and then the role of the lead. So you have a cross-party alliance between the two main parties, as we had in Britain in the Iraq War, as over Libya, as over Afghanistan. A cross-party alliance behind Netanyahu. The role of the media then throws itself. And then, of course, the fascinating thing, which is very significant and important, is the far right in Britain, an insurgent force now in Britain. They reform the kind of non-violent and part of the far right, and then Tommy Robinson's the thuggish far right of Tommy. They all flock behind Israel. So you've got this political alliance. It's very difficult, impossible to express as an ordinary person your opposition to the war without taking to the streets. Enter the media. First of all, the media throws its weight behind the Netanyahu, and also it becomes the attack weapon for the political establishment against the protesters who take to the streets. And I do a lot of analysis of the smear campaigns against the protesters through the press, that the use of and how the police action evolves over time, and I just take that whole story on through until when basically you have to call a day, and I basically brought the story up to when Trump is starting to talk about a Riviera in Gaza, talking about ethnic cleansing, in other words, and there I try and leave the story. I going to. I hope that's and although so much has happened since, and I was very happy to talk about too. But I hope that's the introduction which you were asking for, Abigail.
Perfect. Thank you, Peter.